Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. It's an honor to be with you this afternoon. You have an important responsibility, and I would like to speak to you about three specific issues. But before I do that, I would like to ask you in your report to raise the question of how this election will be conducted. And I want to answer that question in three words: instant runoff voting. In 1985, we had a low turnout election for delegates to go to the Constitutional Convention. There were 562 candidates for 100 seats. And the effect of that was that many were elected with considerably less than a majority. Instant runoff voting provides the answer to that. We can't do it with our current machines, but the Board of Elections is planning to get new machines that Bob Cando, the director, tells me will be capable of handling instant runoff voting, or they can make them capable of that. Instant runoff voting is a very simple process. It's like if you go to an ice cream store and you order coffee ice cream, which I probably would, and they say, we don't have coffee, but we have blueberry ice cream. I can settle for my second choice. Instant runoff voting means that I would name the candidates. If there are 5 candidates in my district, I would name the 4 that would be my first choices. If my first choice is not chosen, my vote is not wasted, but rather transfers to my second choice. It's easy to do on a computer. It works. It's done in Minneapolis, San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, and in many other countries around the world. It's easy with computers. So I would urge you, and It give the clerk some references to websites where you can find out about instant runoff voting. It would be a good thing to test it because it would work for municipalities. With that said, I'd like to turn to 3 topics that I think are really important. I should have said at the beginning, for some who don't know me, I served for 18 years as the director of Common Cause Rhode Island and was involved in a whole series of legislative and constitutional reforms. I'm not speaking for Common Cause. I've been retired for 8 years. So I'm speaking only as a private citizen. In 2004, Gary Sass and I argued in an opinion piece in the Providence Journal that there was no need for a constitution. We thought that the legislature had passed significant constitutional reforms and that we could count on the legislature to continue to do that. The most significant, of course, was separation of powers, which I had worked on for 10 years and which was on the ballot in 2004. But since then, the General Assembly has been reluctant to do significant constitutional reforms. And I want to mention 3 that I believe only a constitutional convention can handle. The first is that we need to bring the General Assembly back under the jurisdiction of the Rhode Island Ethics Commission. As you know, in 2009, a majority of justices of the Rhode Island Supreme Court in the case William V. Irons versus Rhode Island Ethics Commission ruled that legislators were not subject to the jurisdiction of the Ethics Commission for their core legislative acts. And if someone asks me about it, I'll be glad to describe to you why I think the majority was wrong. I believe that Justice Sutel got it right in his dissent, and I would urge you to read that dissent, but that's not really the point. The point is that in 5 years, 5 full legislative sessions since then, the General Assembly has refused or been unable to put an amendment before the people to let the people decide. And that's what we're asking. The people decided in 1986 that there should be a powerful ethics commission with authority over all public officials in the state. Specifically, the General Assembly was the intent of the Constitutional Convention, and that's been broken. And it's time to let the people decide whether or not to restore it. The second issue that I would raise with you is the independence and the jurisdiction of the Judicial Nominating Commission. In the early 1990s, I was involved in trying to establish merit selection of judges for the state of Rhode Island, and people said it's a fool's errand, it will never happen. And we had a scandal in 1993 that some of you will remember, where the second Chief Justice in 7 years was forced to resign under a cloud of pending impeachment. And that scandal led to a real discussion and a real struggle that produced a judicial selection statute and a judicial selection amendment to the Constitution, which Rhode Island voters overwhelmingly approved, 70%, almost just under 70%, in 1994. The problem was that since then, it's been my observation, and I have attended many meetings of the Commission and much here in this building, that neither the governors, nor the General Assembly, nor the courts are happy with merit selection of judges. And in each venue, there have been efforts to undermine it. I could give you a detailed history, but I'll just mention a couple of things. From the beginning, the efforts to undermine the judicial will of the people in regard to the Judicial Nominating Commission has been clear. In 2007, Governor Carcieri proposed legislation that would let the governor, rather than having to consider 3 to 5 highly qualified nominees for each judicial vacancy, Governor Carcieri proposed to open that up with what he called a look-back window that would go back 5 years. Anybody who had been approved by the commission for that court during those 5 years would be eligible for consideration by the governor. So we went from 3 to 5 to, in some cases, 15, 20 or more candidates eligible. It shattered the model of a short list of highly qualified nominees for each vacancy, which was the core of the Judicial Nominating Commission process. To make matters worse, the General Assembly also began to create positions for magistrates. There were 5 general masters or masters in the court at the time merit selection passed. Now there are more than 20. I will not embarrass any of you or the legislature or any governor by reading you the list of names, although that I could. And many of them are related to members of the General Assembly, either by blood or who have worked for them as counsel or worked close to them. What we have created here is a system of magistrates which don't go through merit selection and which are decided by the chief judge of the court, which invites deal-making between the legislature and the court system. And it is an evasion. Again, there have been bills put in since 2000 that would change this, that would bring magistrates under merit selection, that would deal with these other things, but they have gone nowhere. They've all been killed in committee. So the second thing I would urge you to look at, recommend, I simply don't believe that the legislature can do this, to deal with its own vested interest in wanting to control who gets into the courts. The third thing that I will mention is to establish an independent redistricting commission with strong constitutional standards. In 4 successive rounds of redistricting, 1982, 92, 2002, and 2012, reformers have advocated for an independent, nonpartisan redistricting commission. And time again, they have been brushed aside or shouted aside or ignored. And time and again, there have been court cases around the very issues that have been raised. The court cases were most expensive in 1982 and in 2002, and we don't need to do this again. The taxpayers have paid the lawyers to go into federal court to defend the redistricting plans. It shouldn't have to be that way. So I would present that to you, and I would remind you that there is a better way. California voters in 2008, by voter initiative, established a different process, which I can describe to you in detail if you wish. I will to the convention when it begins. But the process basically says that we have to set up a competent panel, neither Republican, or actually it's both Republicans and Democrats and independents, people who are independent, who have knowledge of the political process but are not involved in it, and who will follow strict standards which are established in the Constitution. I believe that we have to do that in Rhode Island. Those of you who are Democrats need only look across the country and recognize that the imbalance in Congress today, where right-wing Republicans control the Congress, comes from the fact that huge amounts were spent in 2010 to turn over 7 specific legislatures, and so Republicans in those states controlled the redistricting process, and the effect was to create an imbalanced Congress because they packed Democratic voters into districts and created districts that were safe for Republicans. I think we could argue that much of the polarization of the United States Congress today comes from unfair redistricting. Rhode Island has not been that bad, but it's not been good either. We can do better. And so I ask you to put as the third item on my list before the Constitutional Convention, which I think the legislature can't do, fair, independent, nonpartisan redistricting, possibly on the California model. So those are the 3 things I would recommend to you. I'd be glad to answer. I support a lot of other things, but those are the 3 I'll start with, only mentioned today. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. West. Are there any questions? Yes, Representative Ruggiero.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Phil West, for your testimony. And wow, it's been 8 years you've been retired. It seems like just yesterday you were here. Thank you for the reform work and certainly separation of powers. You raised some compelling issues, the judicial reform, the independent redistricting, and I've always valued your opinion. So my question is, my understanding is once the convention is called, the delegates determine their own agenda. So what safeguards do we have that the issues that are percolating from the people of Rhode Island and from this commission will actually be heard and addressed in a Constitution Convention in 2016?
Good question, Representative. I don't think there's any guarantee. The convention, as you know, can choose its own chairperson and set its own agenda. I would hope that the very process that you're doing here of getting these questions out there, that they'll show up in the newspapers, they'll be reported, there will be discussion. That's part of what happened in 1985, 1986. And in response to the RIMFAC and Supreme Court decision or scandal involving the Chief Justice, Joseph Bevilacqua, a number of candidates ran and said in their districts, if I'm elected, I'm going to push for ethics reform. We can do better. Those people wound up producing an amendment that created the strongest ethics commission in the United States. So I think that the ferment of the political process will bring certain issues to the fore. I hope these 3 that I've mentioned and others. And then the question will be whether the convention delegates will be elected in a majoritarian way that will make sure that they then are responsive to those needs.
Well, what also is a little disconcerting is 562 people ran for 100 seats, which brings me to my next question, which is these delegates do not face any kind of a re-election, so they are not in any way responsible to constituents' concerns. So they meet at this convention, set an agenda, and it's not like the people can hold them accountable. There's no re-election, correct?
That's a very good point, Representative. And my experience has been that a number of those people went on to run for public office. Governor Chafee was a member of that convention. I could go down a list of other people. Congressman Langevin was a member of that convention. And Governor Sondland was a member of that convention.
Sounds like an alumni.
many of them were. And so I think that it's a process. You're exactly right, though. And that was one of the things that I said in 2004 as an argument against the convention, because the delegates are not accountable and seeking re-election. That's a good argument. But in my view, because of the resistance of the legislature to deal with the three issues that I've mentioned, it's not nearly as strong as an argument that says the legislature has been unable to do this. The Constitutional Convention is a safety valve. Let's use it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Any further questions for Mr. West?